This is Lead Time.
Welcome, Lead Time. Tim Allman here with Jack Kalberg. I am so excited for this conversation today. We've been talking about disagreeing agreeably, setting up space for diverse conversations, people in a variety of different contexts, listening deeply to one another, agreeing on the main things, and then in areas of adiaphora, hopefully having charity one for another as we unite in mission in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. I have a brother who's on for the second time with us, Matt Borrasso. He's a pastor at Trinity Lutheran in Lexington Park, just outside of Washington, D.C. And he sent me an email saying, you've been talking about kind of disagreeing agreeably, setting up space, and there's just very few forums where people are actively talking / maybe with brotherly love, sisterly love, debating some of the struggle points, pain points in the LCMS. And Matt said, that's all well and good, but I don't think people know how to do that. So Matt, thanks for hanging with us today on Lead Time. And we're going to be talking all about cultivating intellectual hospitality. How you doing, Matt?
I'm all right. I'm getting over a cold, so you can probably hear it in my voice a little bit.
That's
so
all right.
Just give a little space for that. But on the whole, I'm doing well.
I love it. So Matt has written a lot about this topic, and he's taken a lot of his cues from a gal by the name of Diana Glyer. And Glyer's written a lot on cultivating intellectual hospitality. How did you kind of fall in love with this topic in particular? Tell that story, Matt.
Well, it comes out of looking for something to do after my PhD, right?
Okay.
So I finished that, and it's one of those now I need to fill time because I got some time to fill, and I needed to scratch an intellectual itch. So I got sort of deep into the work of Malcolm Guite, who's an Anglican priest and poet, and he referenced some of Glyer's work because of her work with C.S. Lewis and the Inklings and all that kind of stuff. So I just on a whim listened to one of her presentations, and it was the second of two she had done on intellectual hospitality, and I was just sort of blown away by her ability to speak into our cultural moment with something of value, something of worth, something that I think we need. And then I realized that she had first written about this 10 years prior. And I was like, oh, well, she's been at this for a while. And so I went and listened to her other one and read her work on it. And that just sort of opened up other doors. But that's kind of how I got into it, just by accident, as it were.
So good. So good. Fostering a posture of curiosity rather than condemnation. We need handles, though, and she says we need to ask better questions. This is one of the, I think it's simple, it's certainly not simplistic, but it's three primary questions that we must ask if we're going to be intellectually hospitable. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So she offers in these two presentations, and I can give you the links that we can put in the show notes or something for people who want to go watch them, because they're both available free on YouTube. The first one, she sort of establishes what intellectual hospitality is. And the second one, she wants to really give legs to it. How do we do this? And so she says we need to start by asking better questions. And she is an English professor. She worked at Azusa Pacific. She still does, I believe. She's on the faculty there. And her work on intellectual hospitality grows out of the classroom and trying to teach students, how do we, who come from various backgrounds, sit down around a text and have a conversation when different things are jumping out at us. And so she says we need to ask better questions. And the three of them are, what do you believe? What information is that based on? And then what moral priorities is that built upon? So she's really trying to get at, help me understand your position a little better. Help me broaden my awareness and help me see what's at stake from your point of view. And those three questions, as simple as they are, they open up and open out a whole range of places to go in a conversation.
Well, I think that's fascinating because it helps you start to see maybe somebody that you're debating with in a different light, right? You might actually find that there's more merit to a person's position than what you start off with in the conversation.
Oh, for sure. Go
right.
ahead. Tim, you look like you were going to say something.
No, Matt. Yeah, go
no,
off.
I mean we're recording this the day after.
Yeah.
A vice presidential nominee has been named for the Democratic Party, and as soon as people say he's a Lutheran, right? All of the people in my circle start saying, well, he's not really a Lutheran. And the first question I want to ask is, well, what do you mean by Lutheran? Right.
Mm-hmm.
I think like in our moment, these questions could really help us sort through things because, well, it's true that he may be a member of an ELCA congregation and there's all sorts of issues connected with that. Right. Simply throwing out statements doesn't actually help generate a conversation. It typically just closes it off. So rather than be the guy that just sort of dismisses it or ignores it, like I want to ask, well, what do you mean by he's not a Lutheran? Like, how are you judging what it is to be Lutheran? And this sort of suggests to me that like, maybe we don't even know sometimes. Now, like I don't mean that we don't know what it is to be a Lutheran, but I wonder if we've lost the ability to like make arguments. We know how to argue from positions, but I don't know if we know how to argue to them anymore. And in asking questions of people and how they come to the positions, we can start to see how arguments are actually built. And we can start to see what's at stake for the person. We can understand where they're coming from. And even if we don't agree with them, that actually might help us understand where we're coming from too. So what is it about the ELCA that we would say, well, actually we have issues with them calling themselves Lutheran, or it's not Lutheran how I would understand it. And that actually opens up the opportunity for us to say, well, here's something that matters to us. And when I say Lutheran, this is what I mean. Right. And to build forward to something, to create something positive rather than just react negatively and shut down the conversation or act dismissively, which I don't think is all that helpful, even though that's the tenor of the conversation in the culture today. It's just reactionary. It's sarcastic. It's sound bites. And it's not conducive to speaking into the lives of people and building something of value.
Maybe just for the benefit of people who might be listening, because you're going to have all different kinds of people listening right now. So when we say, what do you mean, what does it mean to be a Lutheran? I think right off the bat, there's different ways that people define that word. And what might some of those kind of key ways that people define it? One is confessional. The other might be more historical, liturgical expression, right?
Well, I mean, just like at a base level, historically speaking, it was like the Augsburg Confession, before it was this devotional document, this theological treatise that we always go to. I mean, it was a legal document, right? So we forget that to be Lutheran at some point was like a legal category. Like this was a protected religious position.
Right.
Now,
due to like a lot of treaties that were going on and who was the lord of your country and all that kind of stuff, right?
Right. So do I mean that when I say that?
Yeah.
Well, no.
Right.
Like I mean something completely different. I mean the heart and soul of the Augsburg Confession, right? Article 4. Right. I mean the word and the sacraments are the way that create and sustain faith. I mean that the scripture is breathed out by God and that actually, that's the way we get into the scriptures. We've got to divide law and gospel, like you say, Tim. And that's only taught by the Holy Spirit in the school of experience, which is Walther channeling Luther. So like I'm through a very specific strain there. Right. And that's not the same strain that everybody comes through. So we've got to ask what do we even mean when we say Lutheran? Because you're going to get a myriad of answers, both historically speaking and in this moment.
Right. There are Lutherans that adhere to the entire Book of Concord, and there's Lutherans that adhere primarily to the Augsburg Confession. Right. Well,
and I'm Lutheran, not because I'm German, but because I have Scandinavian in my blood. And the formula for Scandinavian Lutherans is a German problem, right? It's not our problem.
Right.
Now I wholeheartedly confess the formula. Do not come at me and say, because I come from a Scandinavian background, I don't. Wholeheartedly do I confess the formula. But like, at different times, it's meant different things. So even something as simple as saying, I'm a Lutheran, you can ask those 3 questions and open out a conversation that actually builds toward greater understanding of who the person is sitting across from you, but also who you are and what you value. It's a way to actually connect with people on a different level.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And just like historically speaking, I know we're geeking out on Lutheranism right now, but in the time of the formula, there was different factions of people calling themselves Lutherans. And this was a very intentional process to try and bring unity to the church, where there was actually already some pre-existing division on some doctrinal issues amongst people that called themselves Lutherans. So
Right.
that's relative to a certain point in time. Right now, if a formula were being written right now, I would expect there would be a big section in there about gender and marriage, right? That wasn't an issue back then.
Depending on who's writing it.
Right.
Well, what I mean is, I'm sure it would be in there.
It would have to be addressed, right?
either way, but depending on who's writing it, it would be written differently.
Yeah. Right.
And that's largely what the work in the large catechism with annotations and notes that came out, a year or two ago, was attempting to do. Let's respond confessionally to some of our more modern day opportunities for law and gospel to be shared. I don't know that we come at, like, we can make arguments, but what is it about it, Matt? And we can get into some of your work, the letter you wrote, the forum letter that you wrote, and you shared it at the Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, a symposium in 2003 on this topic. You also wrote in the Journal of the Lutheran Historical for the Journal of the Lutheran Historical Conference. I think that we can talk. So let's just go into those three questions. What do you believe? But then on what information is what you believe based on? And then what's at stake for you? I think we get lost in two, and then we don't even have the relational capability to enter in, to empathize with what's at stake on a variety of topics. I mean, my mind goes to trying to set up conversations with people that radically disagree on residential to more contextual formation, right? There are different things that are at stake if you're connected to an institution and if you're connected to the local church. Can we sit and empathize with one another and say, wow, yeah, I'm biased toward this end. Like I will wholeheartedly say that I have a tilt. Because I'm a parish pastor, we got a big vision, reaching people here. I have a bias toward more contextual formation. And it's for our purposes to advance the gospel here. It may come across then as competing or maybe even condemning residential education. That's certainly not my intent. But I'm tilted. Why am I tilted? Because I'm in a context, Matt, right? Because I locate myself here. Anything more to share, though, as we enter into the LCMS context and some of the debates that take place, or really non-debates, I would say, because we're in our echo chambers. Anything to say there, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I when I think about like the email I sent you and how we don't know how to do it, what I meant was I don't think we remember how to do it, because I think there was a time, at least, when one of our primary theologians could sit down at a table with somebody he vehemently disagreed with and create space for him. And this is where my work comes in. The thing that's going to be published in the Journal for the Lutheran Historical Conference, the sectional I did at the 23 CSL Symposium, was about Martin Franzmann. Now, I have a history with Franzmann in that my STM work is all on Franzmann, and it's his life and work. It got published by Wiffenstock in 2019. It's called The Art of Exegesis. In fact, I'm fairly certain that when Lyman Stone was on your show a few weeks ago, at least when I watched it, that he was referencing some of the stuff that I drew out from Franzmann's own life, because he actually does end up sort of dying of exhaustion, trying to bring the two sides back together at the end. And he's caught in the middle because he's not willing to choose one side over the other. He is there, sort of brought out of retirement to speak to the church that he loves, the synod that he loves, and not let go of any brother at the table. This is something he had done before, though. And so the work that I did recently, Connecting Intellectual Hospitality, connects back to something he did in the early 60s with a professor by the name of Norman Hobble. Now, Hobble was an Old Testament guy. Hobble is infamous in terms of, just go Google him. His perspective is wild. It's out there as far as the Missouri Synod today is concerned. And the Missouri Synod back then would be most wholeheartedly concerned about it too. So Hobble writes what becomes known as the Green Dragon because of the cover on it. And it's the Green Dragon. It's dealing with the fall narrative in Genesis 3. And so he takes all the historical critical tools at his disposal and he puts them to work and he creates this essay and he presents it to the joint faculties, the college presidents at the symposium that they have all the time, like on a yearly basis. So he presents it and obviously it causes a stir. I mean, it has to, not the least of which because he's like, well, mortality is not something that we were created with. He says like the proto-evangelion, the first promise of the gospel there in Genesis 3:15, he kind of waffles on it at best. Like, I mean, he takes some shots that would put anybody who had grown up in the Missouri Synod at ill ease. I mean, like, this is not okay. So Franzmann is tasked with responding a year later. And the way Franzmann handles it is a masterclass in churchmanship. It absolutely is. And you can read some of the work I've done, or you can actually go to the library at the SEM in St. Louis. You can go to CHI and you can pull Franzmann's words out and read them yourself, which I would highly recommend because it's worth your time. The whole thing's worth your time. What he ends up doing is, at the first place, as Franzmann writes his response, he begins by saying all of the things that Hobble and he have in common. He talks about how they are, that everybody at the table, Hobble, Franzmann, all the university presidents, all the theological faculty members who are there, they are all oriented eschatologically to one another, diaconally to one another, sacramentally to one another. We're all connected by our baptism is what he means. We're all connected in service to the church. And all of us recognize that we have to stand before the Lord on the last day and give an account for the words that we're using. And he includes Hobble in this. Like he's saying, hey, this guy whom I disagree with vehemently on some issues, and he gets to the issues, but this guy, he belongs at the table. We have shared presuppositions, and he goes into them. And the presuppositions, they're worth reading on your own, just for your own sort of devotional thought about how to enter into the text, right? Because Franzmann is this great exegete of the New Testament, and actually of the Old Testament too. He's no slouch there. He actually writes all the minor prophet commentary that comes out in the 70s for that Concordia self-study thing that they put out. But he begins with saying what we share in common. He says, Hobble believes these things. And then before he goes into attacking Hobble and the issues with the argument, he says, here are all the things he gets right. But the way he says it, it's not that he just gets them right. He said, these are all the places where he is speaking in line with the church that has come before him. Here are all the places. And he doesn't just say, this is it. He then goes and backs it up. Like he's quoting Hobble, saying, and here's where you can go find where he's actually on our side with this, right? And it's only after that, after he creates space at the table, after he says all of the things that Hobble is saying in line with the traditional interpretation of the church, it's only after that where he says, here are some issues. And then he goes to town on the issues. Like he doesn't hold back. And part of the reason why I think he's able to do this is not just because Franzmann has this reputation for being ironic and peaceful and loving, but I actually think he is loving. Like I actually think he cares about Norman Hobble and the perspective that he's trying to work through in that essay. And I say that in part because of what happens sort of toward the end of Franzmann's essay. Franzmann says, I think I caught him in a logical misstep. I think I've caught him. So we're going to hold judgment about this in abeyance until he's had a chance to think through it. In other words, I'm not going to drop the hammer. I'm not going to come down and say, look, I gotcha, which is what our inclination naturally is to do, right? To play I caught you in the trap, right? Not Franzmann. No. I think I've caught him in a contradiction. I'm going to give him space. Now, what's interesting is after all this happens, Haebel's document gets published with a foreword from Haebel, where he explains the background and talks about Franzmann and his interaction. And he says, actually, I've modified the position somewhat because of my interaction with him. Now, he doesn't modify it enough for my own personal liking, but he modifies it. But beyond that, he says, there were actually some issues that Franzmann didn't even address publicly, but he dealt with me personally. And to me, that suggests, again, that Franzmann actually gave a rip about Norman Haebel. That it wasn't just words. If Franzmann was just interested in being right, he only needed the last third. He didn't need to set up the presuppositions. He didn't need to show where Haebel was around in concert with the traditional interpretation of the church. He didn't need to do any of that. He didn't need to hold his judgment in abeyance when he caught him in a logical contradiction. He didn't need to keep things private. But he does those things because he actually cares about the guy across the table and cares that that guy has a seat, that that guy has a voice, that that guy is allowed to actually speak and not just be cast out. And so fast forward 12 years when the synod is in an uproar and Franzmann's there trying to hold the sides together, he's just doing what he's always done. And Franzmann doing it with Haebel, that's not the first time he had to do it. I mean, he's got this history of trying to be the guy in the middle, pulling people back together. And so, I mean, my work with Franzmann just leads me to believe that we've sort of, we used to know how to do this. And for whatever reason, we've just sort of forgotten.
Thanks for sharing that story, Matt. It's powerful. And so let's get into maybe some of the why. And I don't think we fully grieved the struggles, the division of Seminex. I'm friends with a lot of guys that are in retirement right now that just have a lot of wounds on either side, right? It's the wounds that we lost certain folks in that, and there's the speaking from fear because man, we never want to do that again. But I think at the end of the day, it's ministry is about people, and I losing my brother or my sister. This displeases the Lord. Right? We should fight for one another way harder. And it has to start with a place of agreement on what we confess. And there's no one in the Missouri Synod. Could we talk about the 10 different things that I don't know. And I'm not in the room right now. Things start with leaders in rooms together. I don't know. And I'll just speak in love. This is an invitation. This is all in love. I don't know that we're disagreeing agreeably, that varying opinions are being held in our two seminaries and in the Council of Presidents. I don't know that we're making that space. If it doesn't start in those rooms, intellectual hospitality, caring for one another, we're going to become more and more tribal. And really, we just live with passive aggressive. We're just allowing passive aggressive behavior. And passive aggressive behavior means, I've got this thought about you. I've labeled you. Probably you're guilty by association because you've got a friend here. I don't actually know what you believe, but I've heard, you roll with certain people. And so I just don't have time for you. So collar guys goes with collar guys, and other more, liberal, edgy around the coast. So they end up hanging with one another. And I will give a shout out to my district president here, Mike Gibson. He is working. I know there are other district presidents, but he is working very, very hard to bridge that divide, to listen twice as much as he speaks. And when he speaks, may it be he's trying for a uniting word. There's just a fair amount of we just lack trust. The building block for all relationships is trust, man. I think cultivating intellectual hospitality is the best way. Franzmann attempt, that's the best way for us to agree on what is most important. Jack, anything to add to that before we get back to Matt?
So this is a question I ask myself a lot. This is strange, but I keep asking myself this question, and I don't know the answer to it. But the fact that it's a question that bugs me all the time, I think is important to note. would Martin Luther himself be welcome in our church body? Is there enough intellectual hospitality that even Martin Luther himself, with his positions, would have been welcomed in this church body? And that's something that I keep asking myself. Are our confessional positions so rigid that Martin Luther would struggle to fit into this church body? I asked that question. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's an interesting question that we ought to ask ourselves when we think about how we deal with the positions that we hold.
Matt?
I mean, it's interesting because I think about my time at seminary, and my journey through seminary was a little different, right? Because I did 2 years and got fed up and quit, and then came back 2 years later, did a quarter, went on vicarage, and came back for my last 2 quarters. So I didn't have the normal sort of like, these are my guys from first year and we're all going together, right? The class I graduated with is not the class I started with. Now I have relationships throughout my time. Don't get me wrong. But I don't have the same sort of like, oh, these are my brothers from first year that a lot of guys coming out of seminary have, right? I mean, this is the sort of one of the selling points on residential education, the bonds you make, the relationships you form. And they go with you. I mean, all my kids' godparents are pastors. Like, that's not by accident, right? I mean, like that's, those relationships are fundamental. And so I think about like my own time at seminary and the relationships I have, even being different than most guys. And then I think about what I learned at seminary, specifically with regard to Seminex, and I'm not going to name the professor, but he said, the result of Seminex is basically this: congratulations, you're right. Now no one trusts anyone. And that basically sums it up, right? I mean, when we solve theological debates through political means, right? When we say we're just going to fire you, and then for the next like 20 years plus, sort of joke that like, well, if you had stuck around, maybe you could have fought more. Like if we're just going to act that way, congratulations, you're right. Like the side that did not walk, theologically speaking, is the side that I'm on by virtue of the fact that I'm part of the Missouri Synod. So theologically, I have a stake in this, right? But the heritage I have from it is now, well, pastors don't trust each other unless they really knew each other at SEM. And even then, right? Even then it's a question mark because of the things that are allowed to fester. And then when you look at Missouri Synod history post walkout, like the fallout with the district presidents being removed, and then you fast forward to the 80s and the issues that were coming to the fore toward the end of the 80s with Fort Wayne, and what happens with Robert Price and his forcible retirement, and the way that story is told in different corners of Synod. The way we tell stories actually impacts how we act today. The way that we carry narratives through actually influences how people see one another. And unless we're going to like be open and honest about the uglier parts of history too, we're never going to move on from sort of the result that came in the wake of certain decisions. Unless we actually like have it out and say, okay, yes, the conservative side is right, but actually they had some dirty pool too. And I'll put this out there, right? I, in my time as a pastor, I served north of Baltimore. Now I serve south of DC, but I've been in Maryland the whole time. And there are groups that are inter-Lutheran groups. And we don't pray together. Okay. This is not worship service stuff. This is like mercy work type of stuff. And so early on, I was at a meeting of one of these groups, and I saw someone I recognized, but I couldn't quite put his face. And then I figured it out. This is somebody who was instrumental in the walkout on the student body side. I'm not going to tell you his name because I haven't told him that I'm telling this story. But I walk up to him and I say, hey, are you? And he's like, yeah, I am. And so we start having a conversation. And he tells me that he and others were called in to the Synod President's office on Jefferson Avenue at the time, and we're told that they would be given really nice calls if they rolled over on professors. If they sold them out, they'd be given calls. Now, I have no way to verify this story, and if people want to come at me for breaking the 8th commandment, you'll have my email at the end of the show. But the point is, this is the story he's telling, and this is why I'm telling the story, right? This is his perspective as somebody who was a student at the time. And if we're not willing to admit that even the side that we think is right has some dirt under their fingernails, how are we ever going to have a hope of trying to repair any trust if we won't even admit that we sinned? And I say we because I'm on that side.
Yep.
Right. So if we're going to rebuild trust, we have to start by saying, okay, yeah, everybody's got some dirt under their fingernails. If we're actually going to rebuild trust, we actually have to open out and care about the other person and care about ourselves enough to say, this was wrong. Now, how do we build out from here? How do we actually cultivate trust? Yes.
Yes, agree. And this was a struggle let's talk about Jesus. Let's talk about the early church. I was reading through Romans today, and it's such a masterful letter on so many levels, obviously theological, but also sociological. We were talking about merging Jew and Gentile, and I love in Romans, I think it's 13, right? And maybe it's the end of 12 into 13. But Paul's talking about the eating meat, and he's let those who, if it's their conscience not to eat meat, if it's going to hurt my brother, that's fine. Anything that does not flow from faith is sin. I love that statement, right? If it doesn't flow from faith, it's sin. So we all, if we've got a problem with our brother, we are dirty. I have sin. All of life is confession, absolution. I don't know why this should be the easiest thing for us as confessing Lutherans. I, a poor, miserable sinner, have sinned in thought, word, and deed. By what I've done, let me say this, by what I've done, and I think we got way more sins of omission, and by what I have failed to do, failing to go to my brother, failing to go Matthew 18 with him, and failing to work toward unity, work toward reconciliation. This is the work of Jesus, reconciling us to God. We didn't do the work. This is the work of the Holy Spirit. If we can't get this right, we're not church, right? I give you, let's just go the office of the keys. I've given you this gift of forgiveness to be shared one to another. As I've forgiven you, go and forgive one another. So there is this, and a lot of times we think theologically, well, this is a passive thing. This is an emotional thing. If you don't deal with the matters of the heart, the matters of offense, you're not, you can be, last statement here, you can be right in all of the wrong ways. In 1 Corinthians 13, we should read it. Love is patient. Love is kind, patient with one another. And the Franzmann story just highlights that to the nth degree. Anything more, Matt, on Jesus' approach and the approach of the early church toward theological hospitality?
One of the reasons I love the fact that my kids are in church with me leading every Sunday is they get to hear their dad say, I, a poor, miserable sinner. I'm the one that leads the confession, right? So I want to model for my kids that, hey, it's okay to confess, especially in this space, right? If anybody, if any denomination, if any label should not be afraid to confess their sins, it's us. Right. I mean, flat out, if we actually believe that Article 4 of the Augsburg Confession is the thing on which the church rises or falls, then confession should not be an issue at all. Yeah. And so I'm glad my kids get to hear their dad say that and recognize that they may love their dad, but they know he's a sinner more than anyone. And I know it too. Right. But to go back to the point you made about, you can be right in all the wrong ways. This is something I picked up from St. Augustine or St. Augustine, depending on who you're voting for, right? So St. Augustine, he said something to the effect of, if you read the scriptures and you get the right meaning, but it hasn't shaped your love in the right way, you have not understood them, right? But if you've read them wrong, and your heart has been shaped for love in the right way, well, then actually you're further ahead. It's almost as if the church fathers, it's almost as if Luther himself, in talking about the Holy Spirit rightly dividing law and gospel and like having to go to work on you, it's almost as if we believe that the text is supposed to shape us. Like, and this is the thing where we sort of like miss the point on like discussions about inerrancy, and we reduce it to like intellectual things. The whole point about saying the text is given by God is that God's got some work to do on you. Like, and if you're starting from a position of, I'm the master of the text, either in terms of I'm the master in telling you what's right and that it is the inspired, inerrant word of God, or I'm the master at telling you how all of this was put together over the course of time, and I can, JDEP with the rest of them, like, you're missing the point. The point is the text reads you. It calls you out. It shapes you. And if it's not doing that, well, maybe you need to start reading a little slower. Right. The problem's not the text. The problem's you. And this is the other thing that Franzmann draws out, not in the interaction with Habel, but in an interaction he has like a decade earlier. So Franzmann comes to the Missouri Synod from Wisconsin. He's a product of the Wisconsin Synod, but he comes into the Missouri Synod in the late 40s. He becomes a professor of New Testament at the SEM in St. Louis. And in the 50s, Wisconsin and Missouri, they're still in the synodical conference. We're still saying we're all on the same page together, right? We're still walking together as the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of North America, right? Well, the rumblings are there. Right. The struggles are there. The struggles over, should we remain in fellowship? Should we allow Boy Scouts? Should we allow prayer like all these things are starting to come up, and there's tension at that synodical conference meeting. And so Franzmann is brought in to speak, to give the doctrinal essay at the convention. And he does it on Ephesians 4, maintaining the unity of spirit and the bond of peace. And he's got this extended section where he goes off on forbearing with one another in love. And
Yes.
And he has this line that love is the beginning of heaven on earth, right? And he sort of waxes poetic, as he often does because he's a poet, about love and what it does. And then he sort of then goes to work on his hearers and says, all of us, like, we do things so by the book, they're so correct, and yet they're so wrong. And none of us is really taking seriously the other guy as a brother. And then he tells a story and he says, to begin at home, I know a man with horn-rimmed glasses, a tall, thin man with horn-rimmed glasses. And it's clear he's talking about himself. And even though Franzmann is like rightly calling people out, he starts with himself. That actually, I had no right to call the guy across the table my brother because I wasn't forbearing with him in love. I wasn't actually like in prayer for him. I wasn't actually like thinking about him, talking to him. I knew that he belonged to another synod and his school had a really annoyingly good basketball team. I mean, this is what he says, but I wasn't actually like caring about him. I had no right to say he was my brother. And so Franzmann like then puts it, after starting with himself, he puts it to the assembly. Do we have any right to call each other brother if we're not actually like loving one another, if we're not actually engaged with one another? And while his words are not necessarily available online, if you reach out to me, I can tell you where you can find them because it's worth reading. The whole section's worth reading. It's just, it's a masterclass in churchmanship and saying, if we're going to fix things, it begins with me, which is why I love the questions from Glyer, because they're framed in such a way to say, help me understand what I am missing. So often in conversations, we jump to the person across the table being the problem. Well, what if I'm the problem? Have I stopped to consider that? If I confess every Sunday that I'm a poor, miserable sinner, well, then chances are I could be part of the problem.
For sure.
So maybe I need to stop and listen and learn something new. Maybe something needs to like start to go to work on me too. And this is why I found Franzmann so utterly valuable, just personally.
I love it.
Is it possible that the fact that there's so much closeness on certain things within Lutheranism, let's say, that when there are some distinctions or divisions, it makes it that much more painful to deal with for people?
Oh, I think so. I am the associate editor of the forum letter, which also means I get to moderate their online, the ALPB's online forum, which is just wild. It's fun. But you get to see all sorts of Lutherans interacting. Right. Lutherans in the ELCA going after other Lutherans in the ELCA, Lutherans in the LCMS going after other, and then in between, right? And in all of my journeys, whether that was doing my STM at an ELCA seminary, or in my interactions with folks in the ELCA, or outside of the ELCA, because I have sort of a wider berth than just the Lutheran circles that I've taken a dip in. Every time I step into circles that are not the LCMS, I am so utterly grateful to be part of the LCMS. Because we are so unbelievably close on so much, on the things that matter beyond all others. Like when I was at Northern Seminary doing an MA, there was a guy in my class who was an avowed Arian in terms of like Arius and the Council of Nicaea.
Yeah.
Wow.
Can't do that.
And it's like, man, the church sort of already had a conversation about this and your side lost. But like when I'm in LCMS circles, it's almost like at the same time that much more infuriating because I don't think we see it. I don't think we see how close we are. I mean, the ELCA is a massive tent. It's a big tent. Everybody's welcome unless you're not. But like, every position can carve out space, which is why just saying an ELCA congregation is X, Y, or Z is problematic, because a lot of ELCA congregations don't actually jive with what's going on at the national level. You've actually got to like
spectrum.
It's a massive spectrum. We are like, find me a pastor in the LCMS that denies the resurrection. Good luck. You're not going to find it. Because
you could in the ELCA though.
Theoretically, yeah.
Theoretically, yeah.
I mean, but we are so close, and I think you're right to point it out, Jack, that when there are differences, they become magnified to really unhealthy levels. Rather than seeing that like, hey, this is my brother in Christ. I mean, like the fact that we won't have conversation, or like the fact that, theoretically speaking, anybody on the roster could come fill my pulpit. But I might have reservations about a few guys. I mean, are we a synod or not?
Right.
Like, oh, he's
walking together. It's helpful.
Like it's a question of if we believe that or not. Do we actually believe that we're all on the same page? Because from where I sit, in terms of what Augsburg confesses, in terms of what the Apology defends, in terms of what the formula actually uplifts as the right interpretation of Augsburg, we are so close, it's not even funny.
Right. So let's give an example. Two pastors in our synod could like both eagerly say, I agree with the entire Book of Concord, no problem, no reservations, and yet they have different worship styles, a more traditional, more contemporary. And somebody may say, well, that's just not the right way to do worship. And I feel like nobody should do it that way, right? And there can be a lot of division on that topic, right? And people can get angry about that topic, despite the fact that both pastors eagerly, very, very eagerly say, I adhere to the entire Book of Concord. No reservations whatsoever, right?
Role of women.
Right.
The administration of the Lord's table. There's some diverse opinions there. The role of the
I'm
pastor.
Just saying, like the fact that you adhere to that confession, like I don't think people realize how much unity that is. That is a tremendous amount of unity.
Yeah, tremendous. But what I'm saying is we love to talk about those issues. And it's like, I think there's a lot of Christian freedom on a number of those issues, and there should be a lot of conversation that takes place, but we should be super charitable. Go ahead, Matt.
Well, I mean, this is where those questions come in, right? So the guy who's uber, uber contemporary in terms of his instrumentation or order of service, and the guy who's the exact opposite. Help me understand what's at stake here for you, right? Mm-hmm. Why do you react so vehemently against the other? And now when it comes to worship, my own personal piety, I lean high church. I do. Mm-hmm. That's great. And that doesn't mean I can't find value in other expressions. For me, the thing that drives worship, whether I'm high church or not, is what Norman Nagel has to say about worship. And that it is, Christ speaks and we listen. His word bestows what it says. So if this is the thing that's guiding, well then, hey, I recognize that certain people connect other ways and other people connect other ways. If the whole point is on either end of the spectrum, this is the way we have to do it because of the law or whatever, well, we need to have a conversation. If it's, this is the best way to attract people, we need to have a conversation, right? If it's Christ and his gifts are coming, that's where we need to start. And if we can start from that basis, well, then we can have a fruitful conversation, because some brothers might see in, fog machines and lights, a distraction of veering away from looking at Christ and what he has to give. And I can understand that. At the same time, people who are too wrapped up in 16th century expressions can obscure Christ, as funny as that may sound to their ears, if they're speaking a language that is different from the language today. To be truly Catholic in the universal sense is to welcome expression across all time. It's not just me and my moment here now. It's actually with the church at all times and all places, which is the church yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And there are going to be expressions of the faith and of worship that you and I are not going to see, that we might have issues with, that actually still might be in line with Christ delivering his gifts to the people on a Sunday morning, which is the whole point of why any of us are there anyway, to receive from Christ what he has to give. So if we can start the conversation from the same place, we can actually walk into those maybe a little disconcerting areas, not in fear, but in the confidence that actually we're on the same page here. So
hey,
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, finish your thought. It's cool.
I'm just saying, if we operate in a place of fear, there's an issue. And I wonder what we're afraid of. There's no pastor in the LCMS who preaches that the tomb is closed, that the tomb had a body in it, that Christ is not ascended and sitting at the right hand of the Father. From thence he will come to judge the living and the dead. There is no LCMS pastor who doesn't preach that, who doesn't believe that. And if there are, we would all be the first to say that's a problem.
For sure.
So if we actually believe that Christ is Lord of his church, if we're all on the same page there, why can we not have these discussions? If the tomb's empty, we've got nothing to be afraid of.
Amen. Well, so well said. One of the biggest struggles today is, and this has fed the lack of trust, is the prior approval process. Sure. And so I want to close just talking about that. You've written a resolution that may get into your district, other districts, to bring more transparency to the prior approval process, because I know brothers in the circles that I've run in that are just remarkable leaders, churchmen, theologians, but because they didn't check all of the whatever boxes that group is kind of, from an identity bias, you're not in the right group. So you can't be a part of the search for whatever the position happens to be. And there's just a lack of transparency, I think. And this is not, so let me just be very blunt. This is not an assault on President Matthew Harrison. This is just a conversation about how the process has been set up. But we're not here to demonize him or anybody else that's a part of it. Would just love to have more transparency, so that the breadth of leaders can serve the breadth of the LCMS. So say more about that, Matt.
Yeah. So I mean, I've known people who have gone through the process and they've been denied, and when I hear their story, it leaves me with questions. And I'm not trying to undermine anyone in the process with the creation of this resolution. What I'm trying to say is I recognize the need to have it, right? Like, we should be concerned about who's preaching and teaching. This is part and parcel to the LCMS. This is part and parcel to our DNA. Like, yes, we should always be concerned about who's teaching whom, right? Fair enough. How do we go about having the conversation about who's fit for that? That's what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in undoing prior approval. I'm interested in supporting it. So let's have a public conversation about the standards that we are attaching. And here's what this comes down to. I don't understand how someone who is deemed not theologically sound enough to teach at a school, teach at a Concordia, teach at the seminary, somebody who is not deemed worthy of that, why would we let them be in a congregation?
Sure.
If they're not theologically sound enough to teach other people how to do it, why are we okay with them hanging out in congregations? This seems to me to be speaking out of both sides of our mouth. And it seems to me that prior approval might actually not be about theological purity. It might be about something else. What that thing is, I don't know. But if we're actually concerned that the truth is what's being taught, and that's the reason why the guy's not getting through, well, then why are we letting him stick around in a congregation where he could really do some damage, right? Where he could actually affect someone's soul. So the resolution as a whole, it's not dismissive. I'd be happy to share a copy with anybody who wants to see it. I'm not dismissive of anything in terms of the work that goes into it. I do not want to sit on the prior approval panel and be the guy making these decisions. That sounds absolutely horrible and a no-win no matter what you do, right? I do not envy Matt Harrison's job in the least, and I regularly pray for him publicly in the assembly because he is the president of my church body, right? Yes. I would gladly kneel at the rail alongside him and listen to him preach because he is a brother in Christ. This is not about him in the least. This is asking the question, why is it that we have one standard for one office and another standard for another, when actually the people in all of these offices have promised to preach and teach in accord with the confessional standard of our church body? So either you don't believe they're doing it, in which case we need to involve the DP.
Yeah, why are they still
and go through the process?
Exactly.
Or we need to codify the standards and say this is what's going on. So that's my concern with but again, this comes from a position of I'm assuming the assumption I make about you, Tim. Jack, I can't make the assumption about you yet because you're not ordained. The assumption I make about you, Tim, is that you actually believe what you professed in your ordination vows.
Facts.
That when you were installed, you weren't lying, right?
Yeah, that's a good assumption.
And so of every other church worker, I'm making the same assumption. That you actually believe your ordination vows and seek to live by them, that you believe your consecration vows and seek to live by them. So if we're starting from that position, then yeah, prior approval, okay, good. If we're starting from a different position, maybe we need to have a conversation publicly, because it's the church that has entrusted to the synod this work. The church body as a whole has entrusted a few people with this. It's not these people get to do whatever they want. It is the synod in convention. It's the church in convention that gets to speak to these issues. So I would like to see the church, gathered in convention. outline the process publicly so we can know what we're empowering people to do and how we're empowering them to do it. And that we're not undercutting the very thing we believe we have. If we actually believe that everybody on the roster who has been looked at, who's been examined, who has been put through their paces to be able to be on the roster at all, like do we actually trust them or not? And the fact of the matter is, we know trust is at an all-time low, generally speaking. But if somebody like says something that sounds a little off, I would hope that we take Franzmann's approach and give them a chance to explain themselves. That we would actually like engage in dialogue and not just be dismissive. That maybe they are trying to express something we hold dear in a different way, because that's possible too, right?
Yeah. Let me ask you a question, and it's a little bit of a question of ignorance on my part because I'm not an insider to the process. So the prior approval process right now is vetting people theologically. Is that correct?
Well, it's vetting people for positions. I think that's about all you can say.
So,
but the positions they vet for are presidents and theological faculty.
Gotcha. So they're not saying this person's not fit because they don't know how to do budgets or something like that. That's
so far as I know. Yes, so far as I know.
Gotcha.
And unfortunately, this is where it gets political, right? Is certain folks in certain tribes are not allowed the opportunity for a president getting a faculty member to even be considered, say at one of our Concordias, Jack, one of our universities, to even be considered. I mean, there just should be more transparency, and they should have the ability, unless they violated their ordination, commissioning, consecration, installation vows, or if they're living like the prior approvals should take a look at their track record to be sure. And if something comes out that there is a violation of those said vows, and I love this, it's in your resolution, they should have the opportunity to speak for to defend themselves. And it should be, we've got a very public process. If you look in the Constitution of Synod, I mean, the resolution, the reconciliation path is very well articulated. And I've talked to district presidents that are like, yeah, that's really, really helpful. It becomes public and there's an opportunity for defense. And if they have sinned or if they've gone against our common confession, they don't agree with their ordination vows, then there is an opportunity for them to move into another synod or whatever, right? I mean, there was a process that's analyzed there. Unfortunately, it's taking place without a lot of justification for why said person was removed from said list. And it can be frustrating for presidents and those trying to lead in various, not just in our universities or seminaries, but also in terms of leadership positions in synod in general. So yeah, it's just a call for more transparency. Transparency will build trust. That's for sure.
So transparency would be, we're going to reveal why this person has been considered not suitable.
If you move them off. And maybe this is where my ignorance maybe the committee, and I'd love to get someone from the prior approval committee to just come on and help where we don't understand clearly. This would be wonderful. But maybe the conversation is had with said Concordia University president, and that just needs to remain confidential. If that's actually happening, I'd love to hear that as well. So, Matt, anything more to say there as we're coming down the tail stretch here?
I mean, it's one of those things, like the prior approval process becomes gatekeeping in really problematic ways, because it doesn't, I don't think the intent is of the process to say, this is the person you have to choose. Right. No. That should be left to the university. Right.
Exactly.
So like the budget skills thing, I don't think that should factor in. I mean, like that, that should be something that's handled. The process, the whole point of prior approval is to say, yeah, generally speaking in the church, this person is fit for this kind of service. Not you have to pick this person. But like, let's say you put 5 names out there and only one goes through. Well, they just picked. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
They just picked the person. And I think that usurps a little of the local power. and maybe usurp is too strong a word. I'll take it my flack for that rightly. But I think if 11 names are going in and only 2 are coming out, well, then you're playing hiring committee.
Mm-hmm.
You're not.
Yeah. And that's what I'm getting at. So like, would there be a position regarding missions, for example, that goes to the prior approval process, right? And maybe there's a pastor on there that's nominated, but he's got no really, like, he's not really done a lot of mission, that we would say. So they may say, well, this doesn't seem like a good fit, even though he's a faithful pastor. Still, that seems to be more of an administrative thing more than a theological issue, right?
I would hope that those who make hiring decisions, that we've empowered to make hiring decisions, we trust to do their job.
Screen on that basis. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Amen. All right. Well, this has been good. I appreciate your work. We need more intellectual and theological hospitality. If people want to connect with you, Matt, how can they do so?
I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. You have to follow me on Twitter and I have to approve you, but, or you could just email me, matt.borrasso, BORRASSO @gmail.com. And I'm happy to interact with anybody. If you cuss me out, I probably won't respond. But I'm happy to have a conversation and to try and put into practice the things that I'm advocating for. I mean, I don't just think it's like historically interesting. I think this stuff could actually help us. And that doesn't mean I'm perfect at it, by no means. But like I see in Franzmann somebody who could teach us to do the kinds of things we need to be doing in this cultural moment, in this moment in the life of the synod. So the more I can commend him to you, the more I will. Go read him. Listen to this one, listen to this podcast, listen to Lead Time, but then go read Franzmann, and he'll help us out tremendously.
Amen. And just so you can hopefully just take these 3 questions. This is kind of the main intent. What do you believe? So help me understand better. On what information is that based on? I need to broaden my awareness. And what moral priorities is that built upon? Help me understand what is at stake from your perspective. This is Lead Time. We're trying to set up more and more conversations. If you've got diverse opinions regarding something we've said or not said, we'd love to have you hit us up. My email, tallman@cglchurch.org, tallman@cglchurch.org. I'm a pastor at Christ Greenfield in Gilbert, Arizona, and you're free to listen to us and provide opportunities for us to grow, just so we can kind of do the same for you in your context. We're better together. Collaboration in ministry. It takes all different kinds of churches to reach all different types of people. Why? Because the United States of America is very diverse. We need all different sorts of leaders under the one common confession: Jesus Christ is Lord. It's a good day. Go and make it a great day. This is Lead Time. Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Matt. Good work.
God bless, guys.
You've been listening to Lead Time, a podcast of the Unite Leadership Collective. The ULC's mission is to collaborate with the local church to discover, develop, and deploy leaders through biblical Lutheran doctrine and innovative methods. To partner with us in this gospel message, subscribe to our channel, then go to theuniteleadership.org to create your free login for exclusive material and resources, and then to explore ways in which you can sponsor an episode. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for next week's episode.